We're visiting with Eleanor MacDonald, a very distinguished lady for many years at MD Anderson Hospital. We have talked about her early years in New England, Boston, her large family, her beloved sisters, her brother, a visit from a gentleman by the name of Arlie Clark, MD, then newly appointed director of MD Anderson Hospital in Houston, who did persuade Eleanor to come to Texas and join the staff of MD Anderson to do statistical work, epidemiology, if you will. So let's resume there, Eleanor. You made up your mind to come to Houston, but that's a long, long way from Connecticut and the family. You have just told me in our little intermission that Mary came along with you.
We drove down.
Now, let's look at our slide on the screen a moment. Is that Mary playing the piano?
Yes, that's Mary playing the piano.
And, of course, there's a third character there.
Our little Boston Terrier, Alexis.
The two of you had played in situations like this for many years, frequently. And to come to Texas and to leave that behind because she was going to stay in Connecticut, as I understand it.
Yes.
Dr. Clark had tried to get the whole team to come, had he?
She was then in
New York.
In New York.
Yeah. And he had tried to get the whole family.
Yes, he suggested because he was interested in cancer eye. And my youngest sister was an ophthalmologist, but she was then engaged, so we couldn't move like a unit anymore, although I would like to have, of course. And then Mary was the head of the Department of Statistics at Memorial Sloan Kettering. And Frances was fully established in the gynecology and obstetrics as a kind of epidemiologist, statistician. She had a small, efficient unit that she enjoyed at Cornell Medical School, right across the street from Mary. So they had an apartment there together, and Dr. Clark arranged with Dr. Rhodes of the Memorial for me to come up as a consultant every month. In that way I could, from month to month, I'd go up and see the different ones at the hospital. I had a 2-day or 3-day. And then also, I had a very dear and wonderful friend at Yale, Dr. George Milton Smith, who was the background figure in establishing the National Cancer Institute in its larger capacity, and in helping the National Institutes of Health to recognize cancer as the #1 problem. He was a very, very great and modest man. His fortune is in the Anna Fuller Fund, which he set up when he could still use the money, when he was a young man, about 49. A very great man. So I used to meet with him every Friday and hear about all these things. And he used to feel that scientists behave better in the presence of a woman. So when I was really quite young, and Mary and I used to be included in all these august assemblies, and we met Dr. Lacassan, from the Radium Institute in Paris, so we met all the cancer greats in the world used to come over there. He'd invite them over, and then we'd be at these luncheons, the pleasantest possible way to meet the most interesting people. And it established wonderful contacts. And he was a little regretful for me come down here, but after he met Lee Clark, he met him when he had the Winternitz, Dr. Milton Winternitz, who was then the head of the National Research Council and a former pathologist from Yale. And Dr. Winternitz and Dr. Smith had both had dreadful heart episodes, and they used to substitute for one another. When one was out, they'd cover for the other. They're really wonderful people. And Winternitz brought different ones up that they wanted to meet. Dr. Clark one eventful Saturday morning for luncheon there at New Haven, at the Lawn Club in New Haven. And after he saw him, he said, I didn't know where the mantle was going to fall. He said, it started at Johns Hopkins, and then at Halstead and Bloodgood, that group, and then it went to Harvard with Cushing and that group, and then it went to St. Louis, and then it came to Yale. And he said, I've wondered whether it was going to Texas or San Francisco. I said, I could see it's going to Texas. And so he sort of put an imprimatur on, and I began seriously to consider it after that luncheon, because he was so carried away by Dr. Clark's plans, and he was at the national level planning, and he would like to have helped Dr. Clark more, but Dr. Clark was an independent doer, and he did it himself,
pretty much his own way, but with the
Yes.
help of many people. But that must have been very encouraging to you, that
Yes.
man...
But then you
could-
see, by going back once a month, I had my Friday luncheons with Uncle George, as we affectionately call Dr. Smith.
Mhm.
And then I had the weekend where I saw all my friends at the memorial. And I finally gave it up consciously because the heads of the departments there began to wait for me to come up. And Mary had all the same capacity that I had. And I was sort of doing her harm by having the really top men there expect me to work their studies with them, set up their studies when Mary could have done it. So about 1954, I gradually withdrew from going up there so Mary could come into her own. You know, she was younger than I was, but she was perfectly capable. But in 57, she came down here anyway. She took 1 year free, and she wanted to make up her mind whether to be a musician or whether to go on with research. And she played in the Boulevard Club for a year, played and sang. She's a talented artist, you know. So that was fun for her. She got it out of her system more or less, and then she began to work. But as long as she lived, she could take she had a manager, and when stroke was getting to her now and then, you know, she was working on the National Stroke Study, she just would take a playing job for 2 or 3 weeks. And even shortly before she died, she was critically ill here at the Anderson, cancer, metastatic cancer, and they told me she might not leave the hospital one day. A friend of hers came in and said, "Mary, they're opening a new piano bar over by the Astrodome. They're waiting for you. When will you be there?" Under oxygen. 2 weeks from the night, and she was. 2 weeks from that night, she played 2 or 3 sets and sang. Amazing. So that it was music was always important to her,
Right.
to us.
Right. While we're on that subject, let's go again to a slide. This is a delightful picture, I think,
Yeah, Mary.
and I think you said this was in Paris.
This was taken in Paris. The the International Cancer Congress, the first one, there was one in 47 in St. Louis. They were held up during the war, but this was a very big one, very big planned one. And Dr. George Smith from New Haven was the background planner of this conference. And Mary was thoroughly enjoying her work at the Memorial Cancer Center. And so they had to have a speaker representing the different countries, and once a day there was a big general meeting held at the main hall in the Sorbonne, all the flags of all the nations. It was really a very ceremonial thing. And they would have one central meeting with 3 speakers, a couple of discussants, and they were talking statistics from different places, and Mary represented the United States. Mary was very dramatic, you know. She was had a theatrical personality, and she just thoroughly enjoyed this part of it. Marion MacDonald, USA. And I enjoyed it too, although I had to discuss the 3 papers, and that sort of unnerved me because one of them was in French, and I didn't see an advanced copy of it. And another, Clemenson from Denmark, and Denois from Paris, and Marion MacDonald from the United States.
Yes.
So it was really a big event. She was quite young then, you know. She was only in her mid-20s, and she gave a fine paper, and she was very much featured at the meeting. But what she enjoyed was marching out. I would have dropped dead. I would have been completely unnerved, but not Mary. She enjoyed the dramatics of it. And it was fun. It was a very eventful trip for both of us. Dr. Smith had gone across with that wonderful group in 1914, Harvey Cushing, Bob Greeno, Osgood, these doctors from Boston, to set up a medical unit to help in the First World War. And Dr. Smith and Dr. Harvey Cushing stayed. That's where he did all that brain surgery right at the front hospital. Dr. Smith financed a base hospital for them. He was with his family money. And then he said to me when we were on the way, he couldn't go to this meeting because he had such a bad heart condition. He had to stay close to New Haven. And he said, go into the American bar at the Creon and look around carefully, because that's where the Battle of the Marne was planned. And he said, I was present, and he told me the story of the planning of the Battle of the Marne. So, of course, as soon as we got there, 15 minutes after we got there, we went down to take a look at the American bar. It's down in the basement of the Creon Hotel. That's where we stayed while we were there, since he suggested that was the best place, and we hadn't been to France before. That was sort of a nice little thing to have remembered.
What else did you get to visit while you were there? Did you take in the usual?
Well, it was the Holy Year, and the Korean War had broken out, and just as we practically went to board the plane to go to Paris, all the B-52s, I think there were impounded to take troops, so there was no way to get there, and so we went to an agency and said, put us on the first plane, and the first plane was a Sabina flight going into Brussels. So Mary and I got on this flight, and we arrived in Brussels the day before Leopold was expected back, and the communists had threatened an uprising. And even the station, the railroad station, was closed. Everything was closed. And you couldn't, there was no cab around there. And from the airport, somebody was out meeting a member of his family and saw us stranded there with our luggage and drove us into the railroad station. And we left our luggage there with one of us stayed with it, and then the other, we went and looked around as far as you could around the railroad stations, and trains were going in and out without anyone on them, hardly. Everyone that wanted to leave had left. They expected a big turmoil there. So it was early in July in 1950. So Mary and I got on a plane, tried to get a compartment. Well, the porter on the train said you could have the whole train. So what he did was opened 2 compartments. And we had been up, you see, all night on this plane. There were a group of boys and girls from American colleges, and they had just read T.S. Eliot's Cocktail Party. And the erudition went on all night about these 17, 18-year-old opinions of T.S. Eliot, whom I had met, by the way. I knew him. But we were interested in this, and there were such kids, you know, all night long this talking went on. When we got off the only seats left on the plane were the 2 facing the rest of the plane. That's how we happened to get in on this whole thing. So we got on the compartment, and we were very, very tired. But we lay down, opened the window, rolled it down, and we thought we'd see Luxembourg. And the next thing we knew, we were in Basel. We'd slept soundly from the minute we didn't see one thing. But after that, we both kept notes, and we were so thrilled at every scene on the train down to Rome. And my brother was a priest, and he had arranged for us to stay at a convent, which was a big mistake. We had to be in at 8 o'clock. And we went to see Aida at the Baths of Caracalla, and the Grand March doesn't happen till 9. And we had to leave and go in order not to be locked out. And we heard it on radio, you know. And that was a frustrating experience. We don't know whether he was taking care of his little sisters or whether he thought he was doing a nice thing. But they hired cars for us. And we saw everything you could imagine in Rome. Each day they'd have a whole set of things so we saw things we never would have seen if we were tourists. And incidentally, Mary was casual about passports and wallets, and she left hers in the cab in Rome on the way from the train to the convent. Before she knew she'd lost it, it was returned by an honest cab driver.
For heaven's sake.
Same thing happened in London.
You mentioned your brother. Before we go any further, let's talk about him, because I know he was
an engineer and an architect until he was 30 when he went into the priesthood. The only professional engineer that I know of in the priesthood. And he was ordained in Brooklyn, but he said his first Mass at our home in Massachusetts, in Boston. And then he was assigned to Great Neck for 4 or 5 years. And then the bishop in Brooklyn believed in using the talents of all his men. And incidentally, my sister Frances and I were in Havana on vacation, and we met Bishop Caruana there. And he said, you know, Bishop Malloy from Brooklyn was here last week, and your brother is going to be put in charge of the Diocesan Building Commission. I said, he is? Does he know it? And he said, no, he doesn't know it yet. And he said also, that your brother is both an architect and a professional engineer, and they want to stop the habit of having a pastor build a church that he dreams of with an American, you know, a colonial, a tower and a Byzantine nave. They can have what they want, but it's got to be the same architectural style. And he figured that Ronald would be able to do this, because he's persuasive and he has the ability. So we got home, called Ronald up, said, Ronald, you're going to have a new job. He said, Haven't heard anything about it. I said, Bishop Caruana says you're going to be in charge of the Diocesan Building Commission. And Ronald loved that for 18 years. Churches, schools, hospitals. He was just the busiest, happiest man. He said, having your cake and eating it too, because he had his priestly duties also. Very, very good with teenagers. He didn't believe any teenager could do anything wrong, because to do something really wrong, a mortal sin as we call it in the Catholic Church, you have to have sufficient reflection and full consent of the will. And Ronald didn't think any teenager had those two provisos. Therefore, nothing they did was really wrong. Of course, they loved him. He was a Pied Piper.
Well, I know I've heard so much about him. He must be a charming gentleman,
night,
even this
one day when Russell Cumley and Lee Clark were in New York, and we had been at the memorial, and I had one consultation after another, and I was going back home, and I hadn't lifted my head out of the statistical arena. I said to Mary, I can't come all the way over here and not even see a hotel. She said, let's go down. Let's go downtown and see what's going on. And we walked down, and we was going by the I think it wasn't the Astor Hotel, but some hotel down near the station somewhere. Might have been the Waldorf. I don't think so.
Roosevelt used to be
one
across
of those. What's the other one beside the Roosevelt? I don't think it's there anymore.
The Penn Station, the old Penn Station,
no,
or Grand Central? Commodore.
That's where. Yeah. So we went down. As we were walking along the street, Dr. Clark and Dr. Cumley called hello to us. And they said they just finished their contractual work for the Book of Health with the editor from Elsevier Press.
Yes.
And they were terribly excited, and they just had a big cocktail party for all these important people up in their room. And we said, we have to go home because Ronald's coming over. And they were going to have my sisters were having a musical that night. Ronald came and brought his accordion. He taught Mary to play the piano. He was an accomplished musician. He played clarinet with Jimmy Dorsey. He just did everything, he's a very talented man. So he said, come on over. So they came over, and here Ronald, had this tormenting experience when he wanted to go. Was he going to stay in the world and get married? And he had an interest. Was this a real vocation? And it was really a terribly hard decision for him to make, because he loved everything he was doing. But he went, and he had to go and study Latin and philosophy for a whole year. And he taught engineering subjects before he went into the seminary, and went through 4 years. So all this training. Well, Cumley and Dr. Clark came into our apartment. And Ronald was reading his office, trying to get it over with. He's out in the kitchen of the apartment. And the ebullient Cumley walked over and says, "Hi, Padre, I'm a preacher, too." Ronald thought he was great. But after all the agony Ronald went through to be a preacher, 8 or 9 years and giving up his career. And here Cumley had his career and preached, too.
A little different
that was the night they met. And then Ronald was talking about the plans for the building. And Dr. Clark sent the working engineer's plans to Ronald. And Ronald was delighted to be part of it, to know about it as it was going along. So that we tried to make arrangements for him to be around whenever Dr. Clark and Mr. James Anderson used to make trips to New York. Whenever we heard they were there, they let us know they were there. We'd get the whole family. We'd have a musical. It's usually kind of a rhythmical musical, But
speaking of musicals, that leads from New York back to Houston. But I wanted to talk to you about the camaraderie that existed down through the years at MD Anderson Hospital, the esprit de corps. This was an old mansion down on Baldwin Street. Beautiful grounds, as I understand. I was there once during that period. And I think Dr. Clark told me there were over 100 species of exotic plants and shrubs and so on. And I've heard others talk about the Rose Garden and all of that. But there was you, Dr. Gilbert Fletcher was here.
Cliff
Howe, White, a man by the name of Bill Russell, a man by the name of Grimmett.
Grimmett, yes, dear Grimmett. Leonard Grimmett, the physicist.
Yes, that Dr. Fletcher was instrumental in bringing over from England, I believe.
Concert pianist,
But he had been helpful in planning the cobalt unit.
Yeah. Pardon. He designed the original, the only one, the effective cobalt unit.
But he was a concert pianist.
He played a concert here to raise money to build the kind of floor he wanted in the old physics workshop. It was a mahogany floor, beautiful floor. But he was really a very exotic, interesting man. And
Well, I've heard the story that everyone wanted him to play, and
Yeah.
he wouldn't play very willingly, you know, and that I believe Cliff Howe told me the story, that finally, to satisfy all these various demands, he I think, rented the hall at the music company downtown,
Yes.
Carter, which had an upstairs
Yeah.
little hall, and then put on his best bib and tucker, I believe tails,
Yeah.
and gave
that concert. He
quite a
raised
nice-
money at that concert.
Uh-huh.
But that was, I didn't see that side of him, you see, because I was a musician.
Mhm.
He was over at my house frequently playing,
Mhm.
played all the time, and I was at his house when he played lots of times. His wife, Nora, used to call up and say, Leonard is playing, so I just come right over. If he felt in the mood to play, he was temperamental, very nice. He died very suddenly here, and Gilbert Fletcher was out at the ranch, and I was afraid that Gilbert would take it very hard, so as soon as I heard about it Sunday morning, I set out to tell Gilbert Fletcher. You know, Cliff Howe and Ed White had the same thought. We all went out there to see
They
Gilbert.
had arrived there before
That's
you
the
got
camaraderie.
there. Yes.
You see, I thought Gilbert might be terribly upset, and I thought I'd break it. He had no telephone out there.
Mm-hmm.
And Cliff Howe thought the same thing, and Ed White thought the same thing. We all headed for the ranch, and we were all there to, because Gilbert was terribly upset. But I thought that was a wonderful manifestation that everybody thought it and acted on it, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Gilbert used to have these wonderful, he had horses, Palomino horses out there, and everybody that liked to ride used to like to go out there and ride on his ranch. He used to have a beautiful gourmet meal Sundays, and people were all welcome. A lot of us went out there quite a lot. He's a very fine host, you know.
Before we go too far along with this, there was a young lady, Marion, yes,
Yeah.
that had been secretary to a friend,
Lovelace.
Randy Lovelace, not only at Mayo's but later during World War II in the military.
Yeah.
Went over to France and wound up in Germany, I believe, after the war. And Dr. Clark had known her because he had been an associate of Lovelace's at all of these various places. So he persuaded, in the Clark manner, Marion to come here to be his right hand, really, for many, many years. She just retired this past year, but I know you and Marion were quite close when she came.
Yeah, she came in January '49, and she was, Dr. Clark brought her down, introduced her to me. I was in the library of the old building then temporarily till the barracks buildings were being built, and we liked each other right away. And she told me she was staying at the hotel she was staying. Some friends of mine were having a housewarming that night, and I went over to the hotel to see if I could find her. And she was sitting with all her luggage, crying in the hotel lobby. And you could only stay 4 days, and she'd been there 4 days. And there was no place, she didn't know where to go. And so I said, I got an extra room, you might as well come over to my house. And so she moved into my apartment, and then she looked out from there to, she searched for a place to stay, and she found a place after a while to stay. And but we were spending all our time together, having meals together. She had a room at somebody's house. So after a few weeks, we decided, since at that time I was also called administrative assistant, that as administrative assistant and epidemiologist and right hand, we could just bring our work right home and talk all the time about it. And we agreed that we leave it at the office. And you know that. We never broke that. No matter how grim my problems were or hers, we never discussed the office at home. We had the most amazing, amiable, wonderful association. We shared an apartment for 4 years. It was very nice, and we're very permanently fond of each other. She's a lovely person.
Marion later married. Her name is now Marion
Lowrey, Keith Lowrey.
And I think she met Keith.
We're not
Back in
quite
those
sure,
years.
but we all together there. He was living with his sister in the apartment complex where Marion and I shared an apartment, and we all got to know him, and it's a very beautiful romance.
She's a very beautiful lady.
Yeah,
We miss her.
Keith is the salt of the earth too. It's just a perfectly beautiful, ideal story.
We miss her very much, and I know
Yeah.
Dr. Clark does.
I see her, of course, a lot more than I saw her when she was working.
Hmm.
Because I go over to see her now when she was so busy before.
Yeah. Well, she is another one of our distinguished ladies that have appeared in our video profiles series, and we found her just fascinating to talk to. But let's get back now to Eleanor MacDonald. There are two more things I want to talk about. One is a book that you've been working on that's just about to be published.
About the 12th of April. Yeah.
And that book covers a lot of work that you've done for a long, long time. Let's talk about that just a little bit.
It's the incidence of cancer in Texas. It covers 56 counties for 23 years. And our method of collection, which I pioneered in Connecticut but did better in Texas, because in Texas I also had the clinics, laboratories, nursing homes, dermatologists' offices.